Our next speaker is Professor Walter Grinder, talking on the role of corporate liberal foundations in shaping American foreign policy.
Thank you, Gary. Mr. Liggio. The original title that we chose for our joint presentation was The Opposition to Militarism and the Garrison State. For some reason or another, the militarism got left off, but there's a close correlation between militarism on the one hand and the garrison state at home on the other hand. War and its accompanying consequences must be, and Professor Rothbard mentioned this, and Professor Liggio backed it up, and I want to pound it home once more. War and its accompanying consequences must be the major enemy of libertarianism. For war and all that it entails is the most anti-libertarian of all possible human activity. I think that we must remember that what the great libertarian who Professor Liggio just mentioned a little while ago said, Randolph Bourne, a great anti-warrior in the First World War, one of the few principled progressives, said that war is the health of the state, and that certainly is true. That certainly is true. The state needs war and so-called military preparedness in order to justify its existence. If it didn't, people would tend to start looking around to each other, saying to one another, what in the hell do we need this state for? Well, why do we need it at all? And of course, there's a inborn or inherent tendency towards military preparedness, in quotes, and the propensity for war. Now, it seems to me it's very easy for all of us libertarians to be against specific acts of war, to be against the specific idea of war. We certainly would be against murder. We would be against slavery or conscription. We would be against plunder in the form of taxation, the accompanying reduction in civil liberties, which follows all militarism. But it seems to me that's simply not enough. The real problems which must be investigated and discussed is the nature of the system which spawns a militarist foreign policy, which, in the American experience of the last 7 or 8 decades, has continually found Americans intervening in everyone else's affairs all around the globe. And we must study the direct and indirect consequences of such a policy on the domestic scene. But in order to do this, it seems to me that we have to take a quick glance at what Professor Friedman earlier kind of scoffed at, and I don't really understand why, libertarian class analysis. It's easy to understand the reluctance of many libertarians, it seems to me, to engage in class analysis. One reason would be the kind of bad name that Marxism has given to class analysis. Whenever we talk about the Marxist nonsense of the capitalists, or the owners of the tools of production being the enemy and the class which must be eliminated. That is to say, the elimination of private property. That's, if that's what you think of as class analysis, then we're all against that, I think, or most of us here would certainly be against that. Even a more admirable reason to be against class analysis, it seems to me, is the distaste that libertarians have for categorizing people according to a group or a group's actions, rather than individual choice or individual action or individual responsibility. I think we're all philosophical individualists, or most of us anyhow, and which leads us to follow through whenever we're engaging in social analysis to what we call methodological individualism. So we do want to go back to individual culpability or responsibility. But class analysis and individual responsibility need not and simply are not mutually exclusive. After all, who makes up a class? We must, individuals, of course, and we must always investigate to assure that the individual culpability in any given case. That, I think we all could agree to. Now, I would like to mention just briefly what we call the Oppenheimer-Nock theory of class analysis. Franz Oppenheimer, a German sociologist, and his most important libertarian follower in the United States, Albert J. Nock. They said, and I think very, very clearly, pointed out that there are two methods of gaining wealth. Two methods of gaining wealth. One is the economic means. The economic means being simple hard work, production, free and voluntary exchange, we all agree with this. And then, secondly, there is the political means of gaining wealth, which is plunder, looting, which we call taxation, direct state largesse, regulations, indirect, all sorts of state largesse. Now, we must understand, then, that the state is and cannot be anything other than a class tool, because the state is the organization of the political means. That's what the state is. That's what it's all about. It is, secondly, a monopoly of legalized coercion within a given geographical area. Now, this, it seems to me, is very important. Since there can only be a very limited access to this monopoly of legal violence, only a very few people will be able to gain access to this very lucrative monopoly and class tool. Any very scarce or valuable tool or resource will, of course, be economically bid up to an extraordinarily high price. It should therefore not be surprising to find that those who are able, and in fact do use the state at will, are among the most wealthy and also later the most ruthless in our society. Those who gain access to the state use it to protect, solidify, and extend their position, which by virtue of that protection from serious competition becomes an entrenched class. And in fact, what we could now call a governing class, ruling elite, or ruling class. This is what we mean when we talk about libertarian class analysis. It's very simple. It has nothing to do with the Marxian model of the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat or any other such nonsense. We're not talking about that. We're talking about what Albert J. Nock and Frank Chodorow called a struggle, a class struggle between what we would call social power on the one hand, which is people power, the power over each of our own rights to take care of our own business on the one hand, and state power on the other hand. That's what the class struggle is all about, between social power and state power. Now, that a facade of pluralism continues on, that's okay, but we have to get to the essence behind this facade. And the essential reality is that class exploitation, which is made possible through the machinery of the state. Crumbs are thrown out to the welfare recipients, to keep them kind of at bay, quiescent. But big business, and I mean very, very big business, is the big gainer. And the hard-working middle-class taxpayer is always the big loser. This is how exploitation takes place. This is what we mean by economic exploitation. Now, taxation is the major source, I think, of exploitation, but certainly not the only one. We have to go back and look at the centralization of the domestic economy that took place after the Civil War. It seems to me that this period was a very, very dynamic, very vital and competitive period in many respects. There was an aftermath, which Professor Liggio pointed to, of socialism left over from the Civil War. But in the main, this was a very highly competitive period in our history. there was a relatively constant money supply during this period of time. This is very important to remember. So this was also what? There was an increase, a huge increase in productivity during this period of time, which led to what? Led to a fall in prices. Now, that meant that one had to be even more competitive, very, very competitive to stay in business. Now, big business tried every conceivable voluntary method of getting rid of competition. You know, what Adam Smith used to say about businessmen getting together, when they get together, the one thing that they talk about and the one thing that they do is try to get together to collude, to hold prices down. They tried it. They tried every possible means of a voluntary extension of their power. But in order to maintain their privileged position, they had, as they saw it, and it would have been true too, to preserve their privileged position, they had to achieve what they call stabilization or rationalization of the economy. So business, and I mean big business, certainly did not opt for a free market solution, because free market solution would have been a dynamic process of adaptation to changing conditions. But big business wanted to freeze the conditions to maintain their relative class status. Since voluntary agreements would not work, big business went to their newly understood, and I think that it really dawned on them in great measure during this period, what we call the progressive period, newly understood class tool. That is to say, the federal government, in order to get their anti-competitive assistance that they felt that they needed. Now, in addition to the tariff and other various direct and indirect subsidies, came the all-important regulatory commissions. The progressive legislation was slipped in under populist, socialist, and insurgent progressive rhetoric. And that rhetoric surely played an important role as a catalyst. But, as Professor Rothbard so perfectly stated in a review of James Weinstein's most recent book in Ramparts magazine, and I'll quote because I couldn't possibly say it any better, "The measures of the progressive era, far from being the result of a mass movement to curb big business, were put in by big business in order to shift the economy from a relatively laissez-faire system to a corporate state economy of monopoly privilege, in which a suitably tamed and conservative labor unionism was encouraged to take its place as a junior partner." And the liberal intellectuals, and this is crucial, the liberal intellectuals played the crucial role of weaving a sweet-sounding apologias for the corporate rule. Hence, William Appleman Williams' brilliant term, corporate liberals. So this ushered in a whole period of what we could call corporate liberalism, or even better, what I even like it a little bit better is C. Wright Mills' old term, sophisticated conservatism. Quite so. Now, it's vital to remember that each intervention into the market brings about a situation that was worse than the situation that was obtained before the introduction of the intervention. It brings about a misallocation of resources, or simply economic dislocation. Any market, as long as it's not totally straitjacketed, will adjust to the dislocation. But it doesn't thereby do away with the dislocation, it merely internalizes the dislocation. But this is like internalizing a malignancy, which will fester, which will grow, and becomes permanent. It's a permanent built-in dislocation. In many respects, we could think back to Professor Miesi's article that he had in, it was given at a Mont Pelerin Society convention some time ago called "The Middle of the Road Leads to Socialism." Well, I don't necessarily agree with all the connotations of the word socialism in here, but I would agree middle of the road leads to corporate liberalism, or what we could call fascism in many respects. That each of these interventions, brings about a situation which is a little bit worse, and another intervention has to be thrown in to try to do away with that or make that better. So it gets getting worse and worse and worse. And these internalized distortions are what our Marxist colleagues would tend to call contradictions of capitalism. Now we know that they're not contradictions of laissez-faire capitalism. I'm sure that we all know that in here. But they are the contradictions of state capitalism, or political capitalism, as Gabriel Coco calls the system. Intervention leads to dislocation, which leads to internalization, which leads to contradiction, which leads to crises. These crises, in many cases, if they're of an economic nature, depression, unemployment, recession, whatever you want to call it, and also social upheaval. Now, in the American historical experience, these contradictions, at least in the minds of the government leaders, the business leaders, were seen as being able to be solved by what was called the safety valve. That was the West. And it's what Frederick Jackson Turner called the frontier thesis. But in the 1890s, the frontier was closed. And we must not forget that this was a period of declining prices, right? So there's inherent in this frontier thesis is also what we call the surplus product theory, as though the United States economy could produce more than it could take in. Well, that's a problem of satiation of wants, and desires. Is that possible? I don't think so. And would a market continue to use even more relatively scarce resources to make decreasingly profitable items? I don't think so. So I think that's a kind of a bogey that's thrown in. What was the option then? The frontier was closed. That is to say, the Continental Empire was closed at this time. The option was expansionism abroad. Now, in order to solve what? Both contradictions. The contradictions of economics, that is to say, so-called depression, and the contradiction of social upheaval, which accompanied these kinds of contradictions, which led to the movement into Latin America and Asia, which culminated in the Spanish-American War, which Professor Liggio talked about. Now, the progressive era was a fusing of domestic centralization on the one hand and hyper-nationalism in foreign policy on the other hand. It was a fusing, and World War I then served as a fulfillment. This is what James Weinstein calls the war as the fulfillment of what? Of centralized control over the economy. And it was a period we could call a forging of the welfare warfare state, as others have called it. Now, how did this happen? Well, there's the "it just happened" theory of history. No reason. It just happened. Well, I don't want to go into that too deeply because I think it's rather shallow. Then there's the pure idea theory of history, which I think Professor Friedman was trying to push this afternoon earlier. Was that one time I remember being at a so-called libertarian conference in which the answer to this question was, well, Walter Lippmann thought up all these bad ideas, and then he transferred them to the PTA, and the PTA transferred them to a bunch of den mothers around the country. And then the den mothers, on their part, asked Congress to make these special legislations. I don't think that's quite holds water either. I think that we have to talk in relation what we talked about class theory with corporate liberal apologetics. Why do I say that? Because almost all of the important both domestic social legislation and foreign policy legislation has been originated within what we could call corporate liberal foundations. The first and most important, well, maybe not the first, but I would say the most important of these being the National Civic Federation, which in contradistinction to the National Association of Manufacturers in the late 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century was very, very big business. That is to say, it was underwritten by at first the Carnegies and the Mellons, and then the Rockefeller money moved in. And on the other hand, there was the NAM, which was castigated by the National Civic Federation people as being anarchistic, as believing in pure laissez-faire, you know, and free trade, real free trade. The most important of all the domestic social legislation and foreign policy legislation had its origination within the halls and committee rooms of the National Civic Federation. That was accompanied by the American Association for Labor Legislation, which was also funded by the same people, that is to say, the Carnegies, the Mellons, and the Rockefellers. Now, these corporate liberal research planning associations, which I think we can call them, became what we could call transmission belts between Lower Manhattan and Washington. And they really became what I would call an informal fourth arm of government, and perhaps the most important arm of government. Because there was a game of musical chairs starting to be being played between these foundations, between business, large business, corporate financial business, the big universities, and of course government. With the centralization of power in the executive over the many years, the foundations have become increasingly important, both as a fountainhead for ideas, both in domestic and foreign policy, but also as a repository for personnel to staff the various executive bureaus and agencies, which is very important. So both the ideas and the personnel to staff these various governmental bureaus and agencies had their origination in this, what I would call the informal fourth arm of government. So the continual goal of corporate liberal foundations has been stability and order, both on the domestic scene, which was shown by getting rid of, for the most part, as well as possible, competition through various regulatory commissions, in particular the regulatory commissions. And then in foreign policy, there's a real analog, because we get into the ideas of the League of Nations, the United Nations, collective security, internationalism. Where did all these ideas come from? Every damn one of them. Where did they come from? They came from these various corporate liberal research associations. Every one of them, from the National Civic Federation, the Brookings Institution, the National Planning Association, the National Bureau of Economic Research, 20th Century Fund. I could go on forever. This includes the more academic of them too, as well as the American Economics Association, for instance, and the American Historical Association. In more recent years, the most important parts of the fourth arm have been, one, the Council of Foreign Relations, which and the Committee for Economic Development, both of which are funded by and represent the views of the very, very largest corporate financial enterprises in the country. Generally, we think of the Committee for Economic Development, or the CED, as domestic, and this Council of Foreign Relations as foreign. However, such boxed categories are very misguided, I think. They're simply different perspective of the same American state capitalist system. The analog in foreign affairs to domestic anti-competitive regulatory system is the Americans' role of the counter-revolutionary defenders of the status quo abroad through such things as internationalism, League of Nations, United Nations, and the key concept of collective security. It is the same anti-freedom mentality and policy being enforced abroad as is being done at home through statist intervention into the unhampered marketplace. But since it is they and not we, the intervention tends to be far more barbarous. Anything that gets in the way of collective security That is to say, the status quo becomes very dangerous. So any movement for self-determination has to be put down, and has been put down in a heinously violent manner. For much the same reason, even if the manner is much more vicious, that so-called cutthroat competition has had to be eradicated from the home front. In both cases, foreign and domestic, the interventions lead to dislocations, which lead to contradictions, which lead to crises, and almost always lead to violence, either riots at home and wars abroad. It's what Mises would certainly call planned chaos. The first major goal of corporate liberal intervention, both in foreign and domestic then, has been order, stability, rationalization, a reduction of competition, and a maintaining of the status quo. The second has been to profit directly by pushing off many big business costs of big organized businesses onto the vast middle class of taxpayers. Domestically, the social welfare programs have all been designed by what we could now call the ruling class and paid for by the middle class in order to achieve, in what economics are called automatic stabilizers, in order to achieve the further desired goal of stability. Examples of this would be Social Security, welfare, schools, and the whole idea of public goods, which we talked about a little earlier. In foreign affairs, these costs have been pushed off by business onto the State Department, the Defense Department, picking up the tab for information and transactions costs, underwriting credit costs, direct aid, subsidies of especially foreign aid, guaranteed loans to the Import-Export Bank, and many of the costs of protection of investment, either by sending the Marines in or guaranteeing payments of nationalizations, etc. This pushing off of the costs is what we call socializing the costs, which is done by separating cost from benefit and making the taxpayer pick up the bill. You know, it's the whole public goods bogey once again. This is what we used to call, back in the old days, creeping socialism, if it happened in the domestic economy. But whenever it happens abroad, we call it collective security, international commitments, defense, etc., etc. It seems to me there's something awry here. I think that there is indeed reasonable cause to mistrust great aggregations of wealth within the state capitalist system. Not on economic grounds particularly, because we certainly have nothing against economies of scale which have and must be reached in satisfying consumer demand. The optimum size of a firm will be decided by the consumer, not by politics or by economists, for that matter, but by the unhampered market working out the problems of supply and demand. But as long as the state, that most important of all class tools, remains in existence, we must realize that there is a where the real and important causal relations concerning intervention into the market at home and abroad originate from, and where these interventions continue to flow, and from where these interventions continue to flow. And that, my fellow libertarians, is from the ruling class, which will continue to fuse with and dominate and control a strong and centralized government as long as the state remains in existence. Besides the great isolationist heritage, which we have received from what Professor Liggio in past times has called the original left or the old right, we received the equally important populist mistrust of what they called the robber barons or the Eastern bankers. That mistrust was surely rightly placed, even if in some cases it was for the wrong reasons. Besides resuscitating our isolationist heritage, as Professor Liggio has suggested, I hope that libertarians everywhere will begin to revive that attitude which led Goldwater to come up with his most libertarian and probably most important proposal, and that was to saw off the whole East Coast and let it float away from us. Now, that's a rather radical position for those of us who are on Manhattan right now, but I realize that. Nevertheless, I think it did, even though maybe unwittingly, point to the problem, or at least maybe towards solving that problem anyhow. The establishment, in quotes, is the problem. But the cement which holds it all together is the corporate governmental partnership. If we are ever to get rid of the so-called established order, we are not only going to have to become anti-statist idealists, we are going to have to become anti-plutocracy realists. In addition to isolationism, I hope that we can get down to the roots of all interventionism, abroad and at home. We must develop an anti-plutocratic as well as an anti-statist mentality. I thank you very much.